Walter Grady, 66 years old, was more than just a familiar face in the Brooklyn neighborhood where he drifted through life for over a decade. He was a ghost with a story no one ever bothered to hear. Thin and weathered, with a long silver beard that hadn't felt the tug of a comb in years, he was a walking monument to time past and battles fought, both on and off the field. His old military-style backpack, faded green with frayed straps, clung to him like a second skin. It was once standard issue, now a relic of a former life that no one around him remembered or even knew about. Walter was different from the others who shared his fate. He never begged, never shouted, never caused a scene. He kept his dignity tucked inside that fraying pack, collecting bottles and cans to trade for a few coins, accepting the occasional leftover meal from restaurant workers who had grown accustomed to his silent nod of gratitude. He slept in different doorways each night, never staying long enough to annoy business owners who were already walking a fine line between compassion and survival. But what no one really knew, what remained hidden behind those tired eyes, was that Walter had once proudly served in the United States Army. Over 20 years of his life had been given to service, marked by discipline, honor, and duty. In 2004, he had been honorably discharged. 4 years later, his world collapsed when Margaret, his beloved wife, succumbed to cancer. The disease had been misdiagnosed by the VA hospital, an error that destroyed his faith in the system he'd defended. Walter crumbled. He turned away from his family, sold their modest apartment, and gave every last dollar to his wife's favorite charity. And then, like smoke in the wind, he vanished into the city's shadows. Sometimes it's easier to be nobody than somebody who failed the person they love most, he once confided to a volunteer at a soup kitchen. That single sentence carried the weight of his soul. Can you imagine loving someone so deeply that their death makes you question your own existence? It was a brutally cold November afternoon when the breaking point came. The temperatures had plummeted, the snow threatened to fall, and Walter hadn't eaten in 3 days. His fingers, shaking from hunger and cold, closed around a day-old loaf of bread at Morelli's Corner Market. He slipped it into his coat as discreetly as he could while Mr. Morelli helped another customer. But the new security mirrors caught everything. "Hey, stop right there!" Mr. Morelli shouted, reaching for the phone. "I'm calling the cops." Walter didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, the loaf of bread clearly visible in his half-zipped coat. "I just needed strength to live one more day," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the chime of the door. 2 patrol officers arrived swiftly. The younger one, Officer Jenkins, hesitated as he saw the frail man with the worn dog tag chain around his neck. "You really a vet?" he asked, noting the ID that looked like it had survived a war of its own. Walter simply nodded. "I used to be someone useful. Not anymore." "We gotta take you in, sir," Jenkins said, genuinely sorry. "Store owner's pressing charges. Says you've been caught shoplifting before." At the precinct, Walter was treated like any other petty criminal. A quick intake, a rushed meeting with a public defender more focused on clearing his docket than hearing Walter's story. A court date was set for the following morning, a preliminary hearing where he'd be formally charged. And so, the next morning, Walter entered the municipal courtroom of Brooklyn, still wearing the same wrinkled clothes, his dignity the only armor he had left. No family sat waiting for him. No friends came to vouch for his character. The room was filled with lawyers, journalists scribbling notes on other, more sensational cases, and court employees numbly going through their routines. Case number 47,293. State versus Walter Grady. The clerk called out in a flat tone. The prosecutor, young and trying too hard to appear confident, stood. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread. Given his prior incidents and lack of a fixed address, we recommend continued detention until trial." Judge Michael Carmichael barely glanced at Walter. Known for his no-nonsense approach and quick rulings, he seemed ready to breeze through the case like any other. Just another homeless man in a long line of lost souls. "Mr. Grady, how do you plead?" he asked at last. "Guilty, Your Honor," Walter replied, his voice barely above a whisper. A chuckle escaped from somewhere in the back of the courtroom. The judge's glare silenced it instantly. Then something happened. Something no one expected. Judge Carmichael looked down at the case file again. Walter Edward Grady, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army, he read slowly. A silence swept over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Judge Carmichael's hand gripped the bench, his knuckles whitening. His eyes flicked between the man standing before him and the paper in his hands. Again and again. And then, without warning, the judge stood. Gasps echoed around the room. Judges don't just stand up in the middle of a hearing. Not without a reason. Not unless something earth-shattering has happened. And for several seconds, he didn't say a word. His face, a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and emotion, betrayed something no one could name. Court will take a 15-minute recess, he announced finally, his voice gruff. The defendant will remain. And with that, he exited the courtroom. What was going on? Why did this man's name freeze the entire room? What had just happened? Inside his chambers, Judge Carmichael pulled open a drawer and retrieved an old photo, faded but preserved. It showed a group of soldiers in desert fatigues, standing outside a medical tent in Iraq. His hand trembled as he found himself in the picture, 2 decades younger, a field medic before the courtroom ever knew his name. And there, in the back, tall and steady, stood Walter Grady. His heart pounding, Carmichael turned to his computer, logging into the military database he still had access to through his veteran affairs work. There it was, Walter Grady's record. Staff Sergeant, 3 tours, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, logistics, Bronze Star for Valor. And then, there it was, a mission report from July 2003. Walter had driven a burning supply truck away from wounded troops after an ambush, saving 17 lives despite being wounded himself. Another file showed him carrying a bleeding Afghan child to a medevac helicopter, a photo that had once made the front page of the New York Times. For a moment, Walter had been a symbol of American bravery and compassion. But like all symbols, he had been forgotten. Then came the final piece. A mission report, classified until recently, documented that during a chaotic evacuation, Walter had carried an injured medic, Private First Class Michael Carmichael, 2 miles under enemy fire. Despite shrapnel in his leg, he'd saved that medic's life. "My God," the judge whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's him." For years, Carmichael had tried to find the man who had saved him, but Walter had disappeared. All he had was the name shouted in the heat of battle, Grady. And now that very man sat in his courtroom, homeless, alone, arrested for stealing a loaf of bread. Back in the courtroom, Walter remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor. The bailiff scrolled through his phone. No one paid him any mind. For 15 years, he had existed in the blind spot of society. After Margaret died, and the VA's failure, he had given up everything, his pension, his benefits, his very identity. He didn't ask for handouts. He didn't beg. On freezing nights, teenagers threw trash at him. Shopkeepers hosed down sidewalks to make him leave. Cops nudged him from stoops to keep complaints down. Even other homeless people avoided him. His screams in the night were too loud, too haunted. He clung to one thing, one tiny piece of his former life. A photo of Margaret, wrapped carefully in plastic, kept close to his chest. On the worst nights, he would whisper, "Almost there, Maggie. Just holding on a little longer." In chambers, Judge Carmichael was already on the phone, first to the VA, demanding immediate verification of Walter's record. Then to Colonel James Mason, who had served alongside both men in Iraq. "Mason, it's Carmichael," he said, urgency pulsing in his voice. "I found him, the man who pulled me out of Fallujah. He's here, in my courtroom, homeless, charged with stealing bread." On the other end, silence. Then finally, a response. "I'm 3 hours away," Mason said. "I'm coming. You said something to me that day, something I never forgot." Judge Carmichael's voice cracked slightly as the memory stirred inside him, vivid and real even after all those years. Walter blinked, searching through the haze of time, worn by the weight of hardship and silence. He tried to remember. What had he said? Then slowly it came back. "I said, 'I got you, soldier. We don't leave our own behind.'" The judge nodded, lips trembling. "You did. And for years I wondered who you were, this ghost of bravery and grit who vanished after saving my life." He paused, taking a breath, the emotion settling into his bones. "I never imagined you were suffering out there while I sat in courtrooms, blind to the fate of the very man who gave me a second chance at life." Walter, stunned and quiet, looked down at his hands. Those same hands that had gripped the steering wheel of a flaming truck, that had carried the weight of another man across unforgiving terrain, that had shivered in the cold of countless Brooklyn winters with nothing but a coat too thin and dreams too faint. These hands had done so much, and yet he had been treated as if they'd done nothing at all. For years, no one had seen him. Not truly. Until now. As the courtroom emptied and people stepped out into the bright afternoon light, Walter remained seated, as if anchoring himself in the moment. Could this be real? Was the tide finally turning after 15 long, unforgiving years? Could a man be remembered not just as a homeless thief, but as the hero he once was, and still, in many ways, remained? Rebecca, Margaret's niece, gently placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "Come on, Uncle Walter," she said, her voice warm, coaxing. "Let's go home." Those words echoed in Walter's heart like the tolling of a long-lost bell. Home. What a word. He hadn't had one in so long it almost felt foreign. Was it truly possible to return to something he thought was forever gone? Outside, the crowd parted for him, not as a criminal, but as a man worth honoring. Reporters didn't shout at him the way they might have the day before. Their expressions were respectful now, even reverent. Children waved small American flags. A few elderly veterans stood at attention and saluted. One of them called out, "Welcome back, Sergeant." Walter nodded in return, unsure whether to cry or smile. The next day, the story was everywhere, on the news, in newspapers, all over social media. Headlines screamed, "Hero veteran reunited with family after courtroom miracle." And from forgotten to honored, the journey of Walter Grady. People couldn't stop talking about it. They cried over it. They shared their own stories of loved ones who'd fallen through the cracks. Calls flooded into veteran services, with families asking, "Can someone check on my uncle, my brother, my dad? He served too." But in the quiet corners of his newfound temporary shelter, donated by a veterans advocacy group, Walter sat by a window and thought not about the attention, but about Margaret. He could still hear her laugh, still see her brushing flour from her apron as she baked cookies on Sundays, still feel her hand in his as they walked through Central Park in better times. "Almost there, Maggie," he whispered. The same phrase he had whispered for years when nights were too cold and life was too cruel. "We're almost there." He unpacked the few things he had. The dog tags, her photo, the frayed blanket he had carried for so long. He didn't need much. He never did. But now he had something more powerful than possessions. He had dignity again. And hope. After all this time, hope had found him. Days later, Walter was invited to speak at a local veterans ceremony. He stood awkwardly at the podium, wearing a donated suit that fit him like it had been tailored for someone else, but no one noticed. They only saw his eyes, which held stories too heavy for words. The crowd waited as he cleared his throat. "I'm not much for speeches," he began. "Most of my life I kept quiet. You learn to do that when people stop listening." A hush settled. He glanced down at Margaret's photo in his coat pocket, then continued. "But today, you listened. You saw me, not as a problem, not as a statistic, but as a person, a veteran, a husband, a man who once believed he could make a difference. I lost my way. I let grief and pain build walls around me. I stopped believing that anyone cared. But maybe, just maybe, there's still some good left out there." He paused as the crowd absorbed his words. "Don't forget the ones who come home and disappear. Don't walk past the quiet ones. You never know what battles they've fought. You never know who they used to be, or who they still are underneath it all." The applause was thunderous. Some stood, some cried, others saluted. And Walter, quiet, unassuming Walter, bowed his head, humbled by the love that now surged toward him like a wave he never expected. Over the weeks that followed, Walter slowly rebuilt a life. He received his back pay in full, enough to rent an apartment and start counseling for his PTSD. Volunteers from the community helped furnish his space. A retired barber gave him a fresh cut every Saturday. A bakery, ironically, just down the street from the store he once stole bread from, offered him a part-time job doing inventory. He was even asked to consult with the local VA office to help identify other veterans who might have been lost in the system like he had been. For the first time in decades, Walter felt useful again. One afternoon, he visited Margaret's grave with Rebecca. The cemetery was quiet, bathed in golden light. He knelt down and placed a small American flag beside her stone, then laid a single rose across the name he had once whispered to the stars. "We made it, Maggie," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Took a while, but I'm home now. I'm okay." Rebecca stood silently nearby, wiping her tears. She'd never really known this uncle of hers, only stories her mother told. But now, seeing him, she understood. He wasn't a broken man. He was a wounded warrior who had been hidden beneath layers of pain and neglect. But he was healing. He was becoming whole again. And what of Judge Carmichael? He didn't just walk away from the encounter with a clearer conscience. He became an advocate. He began working closely with lawmakers to improve protections for veterans, especially those with no fixed address. He gave interviews, attended rallies, and never stopped telling Walter's story. "If one man could fall through the cracks so easily," he said in an interview with the New York Times, "then the cracks are too wide. We owe our service members more than parades. We owe them our vigilance." And what about the bakery? It became something of a landmark. Locals would point it out and say, "That's where Walter Grady works. You know, the vet from the courtroom story." The owners even started a program called Grady's Basket, where surplus food went to anyone in need, no questions asked. A small plaque near the door read, "Some heroes never ask to be remembered, but we remember anyway." Years later, Walter would still walk the same Brooklyn streets, but now people greeted him by name. Children waved, strangers stopped to shake his hand, and every now and then someone would whisper, "Thank you for your service," and truly mean it. And Walter, once invisible, once forgotten, would smile softly and nod. Because now, finally, he had been seen, truly seen. And that made all the difference. When I was drifting in and out of consciousness all those years ago, clinging to life by a thread, I heard a voice, your voice, say, "Just keep breathing, kid. Your story isn't over." Do you know what those words did for me? They anchored me. They saved me. They became my reason to hold on. And now, here I am, decades later, a judge, trying to make a difference in a world that often forgets the ones who gave everything. I wanted to serve, just like you did. Walter looked at the judge, and in that moment, didn't see a man in robes or a figure of authority. He saw the trembling young medic from a battlefield far away, the same frightened kid he once carried through enemy fire. "I'm glad something good came from that day," Walter said, his voice carrying both weight and warmth. "Not just something good," the judge replied, emotion tightening his throat. "Everything good in my life came from that day. My family, my entire career, my opportunity to serve the community. It all exists because you didn't leave me behind." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. For the first time in what felt like forever, Walter Grady smiled. And it wasn't just any smile. It was real, heartfelt, and reached his eyes, those tired eyes that had seen too much and yet still sparkled with quiet pride. "No man left behind," he whispered. That wasn't just a saying to me. 3 days later, Walter stood in Judge Carmichael's chambers, his posture upright and proud. A new suit hugged his frame, and for the first time in years, his military decorations rested firmly on his chest. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and a ribbon of honors that spoke louder than any words ever could. At last, his story was being told the way it should have been all along. A representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs handed Walter a settlement check, a formal acknowledgement of the administrative failure that had stolen his benefits for over 15 years. The cameras flashed. Reporters documented the moment. And then Walter did something he'd never done before. He spoke to the public. "I don't want anyone's pity," he said, his voice steady, resonating with quiet dignity. "I just hope those who come after won't be forgotten like I was." And with that, the narrative shifted. What started as a small human interest story from a local courtroom exploded into a nationwide reckoning. America was finally looking at itself in the mirror and asking the hard questions. What kind of nation lets its heroes rot in alleyways and shelters? What kind of justice system fails to remember those who once fought for its very existence? Walter's image was everywhere. That haunting, iconic photograph of him carrying the Afghan child resurfaced, but now it was placed beside a more recent image of him, disheveled and worn, sitting on a Brooklyn sidewalk. The juxtaposition was powerful. It was jarring. It was the wake-up call the country didn't know it needed. 6 months later, Walter finally had a place to call home. He moved into Veterans Village, a peaceful and dignified housing community in Brooklyn. His apartment was modest, but it was his. After years of sleeping on benches and under overpasses, he now had a bed, a stove, and most importantly, peace. The walls of his home were lined with memories. A photo of Margaret on their wedding day, shots of his old unit smiling in the dusty heat of Iraq, and one new picture that held special meaning: him standing proudly beside Judge Carmichael during a veterans recognition ceremony. Though the world now knew his name, Walter preferred to live quietly. He declined most interviews. He didn't seek fame, but he made time to speak at local schools, especially those in rough neighborhoods. When he talked, he didn't use lofty words or deliver rehearsed speeches. He simply told the truth about war, about loss, about coming home to a world that had forgotten him. The kids listened. Troubled teens who had stopped believing in adults leaned in when Walter spoke. He didn't judge them. He understood them. He had walked in their shoes. Each afternoon, Walter returned to Prospect Park. Sometimes he sat on the very bench where he had once curled up to survive bitter winter nights. But now he watched children play, their laughter filling the air like music. He'd smile, sometimes tear up, remembering Margaret, remembering the brothers he'd lost, and feeling something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Outside the Brooklyn courthouse, a new bronze plaque was installed. The inscription read, "Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten." Next to the words was a sculpture of Walter carrying the young medic, Carmichael, his face determined, the American flag waving behind them. During the unveiling, the mayor made an announcement. A new legal assistance fund for homeless veterans would be launched, named the Grady Initiative. Cheers erupted from the crowd. Meanwhile, a 10-year-old boy who had once seen Walter collecting cans wrote an essay for school. It read, "Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead." The essay won a citywide award and was read aloud at a city council meeting focused on homelessness reform. It sparked tears, applause, and renewed resolve. Walter and Judge Carmichael remained close. Sometimes Walter joined the judge's family for Sunday dinners. During one such evening, the judge's son asked, "Mr. Grady, were you angry about being homeless for so long?" Walter paused. The room grew still. He looked up and said, "I don't need anyone's pity. I just hope those who come after will remember those who came before." On Veterans Day, dressed in full military regalia for the first time in decades, Walter stood at the podium at Fort Hamilton. The audience waited, breath held. He cleared his throat and began, "I once protected this country. Now, the country has protected me back." His voice grew stronger. Kindness is never too late. It just needs someone patient enough to wait for it. As he stepped down, something incredible happened. Every single person, from young cadets to retired generals, rose to their feet in silent salute. Walter returned the gesture, standing tall, no longer a man weighed down by the past, but one looking boldly toward the future. Justice may not always arrive on time, but when it comes, when it finally comes, it makes every second of waiting worth it. So don't give up. Keep breathing. Keep fighting. What moment have you lived through when the world turned its back, but you stood your ground? Share it. Someone out there needs your story to find their strength. And then, as the memories settled and the world quieted once more, a prosecutor's cold voice echoed in a flashback. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread from the local market." The man bowed his head and said, "I just needed strength to live one more day." Some in the courtroom had chuckled, but not the judge, not after hearing that name. Who was this man? And why had the judge's eyes filled with tears? Now the whole world knew.